Every December, kitchens across America filled with the same cozy rhythm. Wax paper on the counter, a saucepan warming on the stove, kids perched on stools waiting for the moment they could stir, scoop, or sneak a taste. But hidden behind those familiar scenes are Christmas candies almost no one talks about anymore. Simple, no-bake creations that once defined the holidays, then quietly slipped out of sight after 1960. These weren't the glamorous desserts you'd find in glossy magazines. They were the practical kind, the kind families made when money was tight, time was short, and Christmas spirit had to come from whatever was already in the pantry. They belonged to church basements, school fundraisers, neighborhood cookie swaps, and the after-work kitchens of parents who just wanted to make something sweet before the night was over. Before packaged mixes took over and before holiday baking turned into a competition, these candies were the backbone of seasonal celebrations. They were fast, they were affordable, and they carried a sense of warmth you only get from something made by hand. Each recipe tells its own story of tradition, convenience, and the creativity of home cooks who made magic out of marshmallows, crackers, chocolate chips, and a few pantry staples. So tonight we're dusting off those forgotten recipes. We're stepping back into the kitchens that once smelled like melted butter and warm sugar. And we're bringing back the no-bake Christmas candies that vanished after 1960, along with the memories they left behind. Let's begin. 1. Peppermint Snow Puff Clusters. For a lot of families in the 1940s and 50s, Christmas didn't start with a tree or a wreath. It started with a kitchen counter covered in wax paper and a bowl of melted peppermint marshmallows. Peppermint Snow Puff Clusters were one of those simple, no-bake candies that showed up every December in school parties, church socials, and the holiday tins neighbors exchanged across the fence. They were soft, sticky, and sweet, the kind of treat that didn't need an oven or a thermometer. Just a pot, a spoon, and a little patience. These clusters came out of a time when home cooks balanced tight budgets with strong holiday traditions. Candy making was usually an all-day affair that involved boiling, cooling, and praying nothing burned. This recipe offered an easier path. It mixed crushed peppermint sticks, marshmallows, and a handful of puffed cereal into a cool, wintry bite that tasted like something you'd find at the corner drugstore. Many families added their own twist. Some stirred in coconut for extra texture. Others mixed in walnuts or used a drop of vanilla to soften the sharp peppermint. The result always felt familiar, even if the ingredients changed from house to house. Part of the charm of these little clusters was how they fit into the rhythm of mid-century holidays. Ovens were always full. Cakes were wrapped and waiting. Fruit cakes were already aging in the pantry. A candy that didn't need baking saved both time and space. Kids could help, which made the candy feel more like a family project than a chore. Parents handed them small jobs, crushing the peppermint with a rolling pin, stirring the marshmallow mix until it turned glossy, or shaping the warm candy into bite-sized drops. By the time everything cooled, the whole kitchen smelled like peppermint. So why did they disappear? Convenience played a strange role. By the late 1960s, grocery stores were stocked with ready-made holiday candies packaged in shiny boxes. Candy making lost some of its place in the season. Families bought instead of built. Marshmallow-based homemade treats were replaced by mass-produced mints and chocolates that stayed fresh longer and required no cleanup. Slowly, peppermint snow puff clusters slipped out of cookbooks and vanished from holiday tables. Still, for the people who remember them, these candies carry something deeper than taste. They bring back the feeling of cold evenings warmed by a glowing kitchen, the sound of peppermint cracking under a rolling pin, and the excitement of adding the first sweet treats to the holiday tin. They represent a time when simple ingredients were enough to make something special, and they lead naturally to the number 2, Coal Bucket Chocolate Rocks. Back in the years when department stores still wrapped gifts by hand and Christmas stockings hung a little closer to the coal furnace, there was a candy that carried a sense of mischief. Coal bucket chocolate rocks were a playful, no bake treat shaped to look like lumps of coal. They were meant to get a laugh, but they also gave families a way to stretch simple ingredients into something that felt special. You'd find them at church potlucks, office holiday tables, and children's parties where no one could resist the joke: coal that tasted better than any gift. This candy came out of the post war era when parents were balancing new optimism with old habits of frugality. Sugar was easier to buy again, but people still relied on recipes that saved time and money. Chocolate rocks were perfect for that. They used crushed cookies, cocoa, sweetened milk, and whatever nuts or dried fruit happened to be in the pantry. Everything was mixed into a dense fudge, shaped by hand, and rolled in powdered sugar or cocoa so they'd resemble the real thing. Some families even tucked a few of them into stockings as a lighthearted warning for kids who'd been almost naughty. What made these treats so popular wasn't just the taste, it was the spirit behind them. They were simple enough for children to make, and that made the tradition stick. Families set out bowls of ingredients, gave each child a spoon, and let the mixing begin. The kitchen filled with laughter as kids shaped the warm chocolate into lumpy nuggets. In the background, someone always told the story about coal in stockings and how it could still happen. The candy felt tied to an older Christmas, one shaped by fireplaces, winter chores, and the idea that the season mixed sweetness with good humor. But the world shifted in the 1960s. Modern appliances changed how people cooked. New candies showed up on store shelves with bright wrappers and holiday themes, each one designed to look perfectly manufactured. Compared to that, handmade rocks looked rustic. They fell out of party spreads as people leaned toward polished treats and store-bought boxes that promised consistency. By the time microwave fudge arrived in the 1970s, coal bucket chocolate rocks were already fading from memory. For the people who grew up with them, these little chocolate lumps hold a different meaning. They bring back dimly lit living rooms, garlands draped over mantels, and the soft crackle of a real fire. They remind folks of stockings that sagged under their own weight and of a time when holiday fun didn't depend on perfect presentation. They're a tiny piece of a season that felt slower, warmer, and a little more personal, and they opened the door to another forgotten classic, one that traded humor for beauty. The next treat wasn't shaped like a joke. It was layered, colorful, and sliced into perfect squares after a night in the fridge. Number 3, ribbon layer icebox squares. There was a time when Christmas tables didn't shine with store-bought fudge or polished bakery trays. Instead, they held homemade treasures that felt almost ceremonial. Ribbon layer icebox squares were one of those quiet showstoppers. These striped bars looked fancy, but didn't require an oven, which made them a gift to anyone already juggling fruitcakes, roasts, and crowded stovetops. Families chilled them in enamel pans overnight, then sliced them in the morning to reveal neat layers of chocolate, custard, and graham cracker crumbs stacked like little holiday bricks. These squares rose to popularity in the 1940s and 50s, when refrigeration was finally becoming common in American homes. Before that, ice boxes were literal boxes with blocks of ice inside, and anything that didn't need heat was considered a blessing. Icebox cakes and cookies were some of the first modern desserts people associated with convenience. For Christmas, versions like these ribbon squares became a bit of a tradition. They offered the elegance people associated with holiday baking, but they came together in just a few steps: melt, layer, chill, slice. Even the colors felt festive. Some families tinted one layer pink with canned cherry juice or added a thin minty stripe to celebrate the season. Part of the magic was watching the layers form. Kids hovered near the kitchen counter, waiting for the next pour. The bottom layer was always the most substantial, usually chocolate mixed with crushed crackers or vanilla wafers. The middle layer was custard or vanilla cream, pale and smooth. The top was whatever the family preferred: more chocolate, a glossy fruit layer, or a pastel strip that made the bars look almost like old-fashioned ribbon candy. By the time everything was chilled, the dessert seemed almost too pretty to cut. They mattered for another reason. These bars traveled well. Families packed them into wax paper lined tins and carried them to community halls, school programs, and office holiday luncheons. They held their shape, looked impressive, and didn't cost much to make. In an era when gatherings were frequent and expectations were high, a dependable no-bake treat earned its spot in the season. Ribbon layer icebox squares checked every box, but like many mid-century recipes, they slipped away as tastes changed. By the late 1960s, boxed puddings, instant mixes, and ready-made cookie trays offered faster, brighter, and more predictable results. People leaned to new holiday trends, swapping handcrafted layers for sheet pan brownies and factory-made chocolates. Icebox desserts began to feel old, associated with earlier generations and quieter kitchens. Slowly, the ribbon squares disappeared from cookbooks and family binders. For the families who remember them, these bars bring back more than flavor. They recall the cold morning air when someone opened the icebox to check if the dessert had set. They bring back card tables covered in red cloth, children waiting for their slice, and the soft scrape of a knife revealing the hidden stripes. They carry a sense of care, the idea that a simple dessert could feel like a holiday gift. And they lead to another treat that delivered comfort in a different way. Instead of delicate layers, the next candy brought sticky hands, spicy aroma, and the unmistakable snap of ginger. 4. Molasses ginger chew drops. In the years when Christmas kitchens smelled like cloves, nutmeg, and simmering cider, there was a small no-bake candy that slipped into the season without much fuss. Molasses ginger chew drops were humble, sticky, and shaped by hand. They didn't sparkle like ribbon cookies or shine like chocolate fudge, but they carried the deep, warm flavors people associated with old-fashioned holiday baking. These little drops were made when ovens were already packed with cakes and pies, and families needed something sweet that didn't demand more space or attention. The roots of this candy reach back to generations that prized molasses for its affordability and flavor. Even before the 20th century, molasses-based treats were common winter fare because the syrup kept well and added a bold, comforting taste. By the 1940s and 50s, families combined molasses, ginger, butter, and a bit of sugar over a low flame until the mixture turned glossy and fragrant. Once it thickened, the warm candy was spooned onto wax paper or rolled into little balls. Some families coated them in flour or powdered sugar to keep the stickiness under control. Others added a pinch of cinnamon or a few chopped nuts. Every house had its own version. These candies mattered because they fit into a holiday rhythm shaped by scarcity and practicality. Not every family had enough oven space. Some lived in small apartments. Some hosted large gatherings where every shelf, counter, and stovetop was already spoken for. Chew drops offered something different. They brought the flavors of gingerbread without requiring a tray or a timer. The process was simple enough that older children could help stir the pot, watching the mixture bubble and darken as the spices filled the room. It was the kind of recipe people handed down without measuring spoons, relying on memory and instinct. There was something unexpectedly emotional about these little drops. They looked plain, almost unimpressive, but they carried the taste of earlier Christmases defined by wood stoves and candlelit dining rooms. For many families, they were a link between old and new traditions. The flavor had a kick. The molasses sweetness lingered, and the ginger warmed the throat on cold winter nights. They felt like candy made for storytelling, the kind shared after dinner when elders talked about the holidays of their childhood. Their disappearance came quietly. As holiday baking shifted toward lighter, brighter flavors, dark molasses candies began to feel old-fashioned. Supermarkets introduced new ingredients and pre-made treats that were easier to wrap, store, and gift. By the time the 1960s arrived, families gravitated toward peppermint barks, boxed chocolates, and modern recipes that photographed better and matched the trend of clean, colorful holiday tables. The chew drops, with their rustic look and sticky texture, faded from sight. But for those who remember them, just one bite brings back a whole scene. A small kitchen glowing with warm light, a pot cooling on the counter, and the unmistakable smell of ginger rising in the air. They remind us that Christmas wasn't always about polished perfection. Sometimes it was about a simple pot of candy, stirred slowly and shared generously. 5. Stained glass fruit cubes. There was a moment in mid-century Christmas cooking when color mattered almost as much as flavor. Holiday tables were decorated with bright gelatin salads, pastel cookies, and candies that looked like art projects. Stained glass fruit cubes fit perfectly into that era. These little squares were made from chopped candied fruit, nuts, and condensed milk bound together with softened gelatin. Once chilled, they sliced into jewel-like blocks that looked like tiny church windows glowing in December light. They weren't fancy, but they made people smile. This candy appeared in community cookbooks and homemaker magazines during the 1940s and 50s, when gelatin became a symbol of modern convenience. It didn't require baking, it kept well, and it could transform small amounts of ingredients into something that looked impressive. For families on a budget, stained glass fruit cubes offered a treat that felt festive without stretching the pantry. They usually started with whatever candied fruit was left over from fruitcake prep. Green cherries, red cherries, golden pineapple, and sometimes chopped dates gave the cubes their iconic mosaic look. They mattered because they broke up the monotony of darker holiday flavors. Amid plates of gingerbread, chocolate fudge, and molasses cookies, these bright squares brought cheer. Kids loved the colors. Adults liked how easily they came together. All it took was melting the gelatin, stirring in the fruit and nuts, pouring the mixture into a tray, and chilling it overnight. The next morning, the candy sliced into neat squares that held their shape, ready for parties, gift tins, or school holiday tables. There's an emotional layer to these candies, too. They capture a period when Christmas felt handmade in a different way. Families didn't aim for elegance, they aimed for abundance. Trays were filled with home-crafted treats, each one reflecting the ingredients people had on hand. Stained glass fruit cubes fit that spirit perfectly. They were the kind of candy children remembered sneaking from the refrigerator late at night, the door casting a cold glow across the kitchen floor. They were the pieces grandparents handed out during card games, the kind that left sticky fingerprints but brought quiet joy. Their disappearance came with a shift in taste. By the 1960s, candied fruit fell out of fashion except in fruit cakes, which were already becoming a holiday punchline. New candies were smoother, richer, and more polished. Gelatin desserts lost their place at the center of holiday spreads. And as the trend leaned towards store-bought treats, the humble little fruit cubes began to feel outdated. Families stopped passing down the recipe, and before long, it was gone from most Christmas traditions. For the people who still remember them, these cubes bring back a softer, simpler season. A time when the kitchen smelled of roasted nuts and citrus peel, when the refrigerator hummed quietly behind a crowded counter, and when color itself felt like part of the celebration. They remind us that Christmas once had a homespun charm built from small, bright pieces. And now we turn to another vanished treasure, one that floated somewhere between candy and cloud. Number 6. Pecan Divinity Clouds, no-cook version. Anyone who has ever made traditional divinity knows it can turn on you in a heartbeat. One gust of humidity, one extra stir, and the whole batch collapses. That's why the no-cook version that appeared in mid-century kitchens felt like a small Christmas miracle. Pecan divinity clouds were soft, sweet, and airy, but they didn't require boiling sugar or testing for hardball stages. They came together with marshmallow cream, powdered sugar, chopped pecans, and a little vanilla. A brief stir, a quick scoop onto wax paper, and suddenly you had a candy that tasted like divinity without all the stress. The candy found its moment in the late 1940s and 1950s when shortcuts were celebrated. New appliances promised easier holidays, and magazines pushed recipes that saved time for busy families. Traditional divinity was beautiful, but it demanded patience and experience. Many younger home cooks didn't have the technique or simply didn't want to risk a failed batch on a crowded December afternoon. The no-cook version offered a more forgiving path. It gave people the taste they associated with family gatherings, church socials, and Southern holiday tables, but with a process anyone could manage. What made these little clouds special wasn't just the convenience, it was the texture. They held a soft, melt-in-the-mouth sweetness that felt almost weightless. The pecans added a gentle crunch, and the vanilla tied everything together in a way that felt warm and familiar. They were the kind of candy that disappeared quickly because guests always reached for just one more. People shaped them into small mounds, sometimes dusting them with powdered sugar so they looked like freshly fallen snow. There was emotion wrapped up in them, too. In many homes, traditional divinity marked the start of serious holiday cooking, the kind that required focus and skill. Switching to a shortcut recipe sometimes felt like a quiet admission that life was different now. Families were busier. Kitchens were smaller. Christmas wasn't always the long, slow process older generations remembered. And yet, even with the easier method, the taste still brought people back to childhood kitchens, scented with vanilla, roasted pecans, and cold winter air drifting in from a cracked window. So why did this version vanish? As the 1960s approached, packaged candies and boxed chocolates grew more popular. The rise of new flavors and textures, peppermint bark, molded chocolates, mass-produced nougat, pushed simpler homemade treats aside. The no-cook divinity began to feel old-fashioned, tucked in with recipes people associated with earlier, quieter times. Once it stopped appearing in community cookbooks, it faded fast. For those who remember them, one bite recalls a holiday table covered in wax paper, each mound cooling beside bowls of nuts and ribbons of tinsel. It brings back the sound of relatives talking in the next room, the soft clink of serving spoons, and the easy warmth of small traditions that didn't need perfection to matter. Now we move from airy sweetness to something richer and a little more playful. 7. Cherry Mash Holiday Rounds. Long before holiday candy aisles stretched across entire supermarkets, families often recreated their favorite treats at home. Cherry Mash Holiday Rounds were one of those homemade versions that felt both thrifty and festive. Inspired by the classic Cherry Mash candy bar, these little rounds were shaped on wax paper, filled with sweet cherry fondant, and covered in a crunchy chocolate and peanut coating. They were bright, cheerful, and surprisingly easy for how impressive they looked. For many families, they were the unofficial special candy that only appeared in December. This treat showed up in kitchens throughout the 1940s and 50s, especially in regions where the original cherry mash wasn't available. Cookbooks and newspaper columns shared homemade versions that used pantry staples, maraschino cherries, powdered sugar, a bit of butter, and sometimes a drop of red food coloring. The cherry center was rolled into small balls, chilled, and then dipped into melted chocolate mixed with chopped peanuts. Once they set, each piece looked like a tiny, rustic truffle with a bright burst of color inside. They mattered for a simple reason. They felt celebratory. Christmas candy in that era wasn't about elegance. It was about generosity and abundance. Cherry Mash Rounds offered both. They tasted richer than most no-bake sweets and looked like something you'd bring to a party with pride. Kids loved helping with the cherry filling because it meant getting to sneak a few maraschino cherries along the way. Adults appreciated how far the recipe could stretch. A single jar of cherries could produce dozens of candies. There was an emotional dimension, too. These candies were tied to the ritual of holiday gift giving between neighbors, coworkers, and extended family. People packed them into small paper boxes tied with string. Some wrapped sets of 4 or 6 in waxed paper, like little parcels. They were the treats families carried to school programs, church potlucks, and office parties where every table was lined with homemade tins. There was something heartwarming about biting into the bright cherry center, a reminder that the season was meant to be sweet, colorful, and shared. Their disappearance had a lot to do with changing tastes. By the 1960s, maraschino cherries slipped out of fashion, except for cocktail garnishes and a few nostalgic desserts. Chocolate and peanut mixtures were replaced by smooth molded chocolates and commercial truffles. People leaned toward more polished holiday treats, especially as boxed assortments became affordable and widely available. Cherry mash rounds started to feel old-fashioned, too sticky, too bright, too much like something from a church basement bake sale. Eventually, the recipe vanished from most family binders. But for anyone who grew up with them, they bring back memories of crowded counters, bowls of melting chocolate, and the clatter of teaspoons tapping against jars of cherries. They recall evenings when families worked side by side, assembling trays of treats that filled the whole house with warmth. There was pride in making something by hand, even if it wasn't perfect. And now we turn to a Christmas candy that delighted kids as much for its shape as for its flavor. It didn't use cherries at all, just cereal, marshmallows, and a bit of food coloring to turn a simple cluster into a tiny green wreath. 8. Candied cornflake holly bites. If you grew up flipping through mid-century holiday magazines or attending school Christmas fairs, you probably remember a certain bright green candy clustered into little holly wreaths. Candied cornflake holly bites were simple, cheerful, and easy enough for kids to make. They didn't require an oven, and they looked like something straight out of a Christmas storybook. With their glossy green glow and tiny red candy berries, they became a staple of December potlucks and classroom parties. For many families, these wreaths were the first sign the season had officially begun. They first appeared in the late 1950s, a time when cereal companies were pushing creative holiday uses for their products. Cornflakes were cheap, sturdy, and easy to coat with melted marshmallows. Households that were already busy baking cakes, pies, and breads loved that these didn't need the oven. All you had to do was melt marshmallows with a bit of butter, tint the mixture green, fold in the cereal, and form small wreaths on wax paper. A few red cinnamon candies pressed on top finished the look. They didn't pretend to be fancy. They were fun, colorful, and unmistakably homemade. These wreaths mattered because they brought a playful spirit to the season. Plenty of holiday candies were brown or white or dusted in powdered sugar. Cornflake holly bites were unapologetically bright. Kids gathered around the counter with sticky fingers, shaping the warm mixture into circles. Some families used greased spoons instead of hands. Others let the candy cool just enough to touch so kids could shape them themselves. No matter the method, the process created its own kind of joy. There was laughter, chatter, and the clink of cereal bowls on countertops. The aroma of melted marshmallow mixed with the sharp scent of cinnamon candies filled the kitchen. But the candy also reflected a shift in mid-century holiday traditions. Families were beginning to experiment with quick, creative, novelty-style recipes. These wreaths fit perfectly into that trend. They weren't tied to a long history or regional tradition. They were simply festive, eye-catching, and easy to share. You could make dozens in under an hour, which made them perfect for large gatherings and school events where homemade treats were expected. Their disappearance happened gradually. By the mid 1960s and 70s, people leaned toward more polished holiday desserts. Artificially colored candies fell out of favor, and cornflake based sweets began to feel dated. Store bought treats also became more common at school events, leaving little room for homemade candies that looked a bit rustic. Even marshmallow based candies began to fade as new packaged confections took over holiday tables. Before long, cornflake holly bites slipped out of cookbooks, remembered only by those who once made them with their parents or grandparents. For the people who recall them, just the thought of these little wreaths brings back a swirl of memories. A kitchen full of warmth, the gentle mess of cereal sticking to fingers, the excitement of making something colorful for a Christmas party. They represent a time when holiday treats didn't need to be perfect, they only needed to be shared. Up next comes a candy that delivered a very different kind of nostalgia. Instead of bright colors and marshmallows, it offered a powdered sugar snowstorm wrapped around dried fruit and nuts. Sharper 9. Date Nut Snow Logs. There was a time when Christmas candy didn't rely on bright colors or elaborate decorations. Instead, it drew its charm from simple ingredients that carried deep, comforting flavor. Date nut snow logs were one of those quiet classics. They were made from chopped dates, crushed cookies or cereal, a bit of butter, and finely diced nuts. Once everything was mixed and shaped into logs, the whole thing was rolled in powdered sugar until it looked like a snow-covered branch pulled in from the yard. They showed up in cookie tins, on church dessert tables, and in the center of family Christmas platters long before more polished treats took over. This candy had its roots in the early 20th century, when dates became a popular pantry item thanks to increased imports and clever advertising. By the 1940s and 50s, dates were a holiday staple. They were affordable, kept well, and added natural sweetness at a time when sugar was still rationed or limited for many families. Recipes using them spread through community cookbooks and women's magazines, especially around Christmas. Snow logs were one of the easiest no-bake versions. You could warm the mixture on the stovetop, shape it by hand, and have a whole batch cooling on wax paper in minutes. What made them matter wasn't just convenience. It was their place in holiday tradition. Families kept them on hand for unexpected visitors because the logs sliced beautifully into neat, sweet rounds. They traveled well, which meant they showed up in office gift boxes and trays carried to school programs. The powdered sugar gave them a festive look without any fancy effort. And the flavor, rich, nutty, lightly caramelized from the dates, felt like something pulled from an older Christmas, the kind shaped by homemade candies stored in tins lined with newspaper clippings. There was also a sentimental side to these logs. They were often made by grandparents who relied on memory instead of measuring cups. Many kids grew up watching older relatives stir the warm date mixture, press it into shape on the counter, and roll the log through powdered sugar like it was snow from the first winter storm. The process wasn't precise. 10. Butterscotch haystack nests. If you grew up around church potlucks, school Christmas fairs, or those bustling neighborhood cookie swaps of the 70s and 80s, you probably remember seeing a tray of butterscotch haystack nests somewhere on the table. They were never the most decorative dessert, and they didn't sparkle like sugar-coated cookies or shine like glossy fudge squares. But for some reason, people always reached for them. They had a charm that was simple and warm, and every household that made them seemed to have their own little twist. The recipe itself couldn't be easier. You melted a bag of butterscotch chips on the stovetop, stirred in a handful of chow mein noodles, and mixed until everything was coated. The noodles gave the candy its crunch and its name. When you dropped spoonfuls of the mixture onto wax paper, they fell into loose, nest-like shapes on their own. Some families pressed a small dent in the center and added peanuts or a few colored mini marshmallows. Others left them plain and let the butterscotch do all the talking. Either way, they set in minutes, which made them perfect for anyone who needed a quick dessert in the middle of a busy holiday week. But the reason these little clusters stuck around had less to do with convenience and more to do with how they fit into the rhythm of December life. They were a kid-friendly recipe, which meant parents could hand over the mixing bowl without worrying about ovens or complicated steps. Children liked the crunch and the sweetness. Teens grabbed them on the way out the door. Adults appreciated that they didn't crumble the moment you picked one up. They traveled well in tins and stayed crisp for days, so they were ideal for swapping, mailing, or gifting. In many homes, they weren't just a treat. They became part of the holiday routine. You made a batch while watching Christmas movies. You set out a few for visiting relatives. You tucked the rest away in the fridge to keep them from disappearing too quickly. They were a reminder that not every memorable holiday recipe needed a long list of ingredients or a full afternoon in the kitchen. Sometimes all it took was a stovetop, a bag of butterscotch chips, and the willingness to create something small that made people smile. By the time the season wrapped up, the haystacks were usually long gone, but the memory of making them had already settled into the background of the holiday, quiet, comforting, and familiar. They were never meant to be showstoppers. If you look back at these recipes now, you realize they were more than quick holiday treats. They were little snapshots of the way families lived. They came from a time when Christmas wasn't about perfect photos or matching table settings. It was about whatever you could make together. A bowl, a spoon, and a few ingredients were enough to create something everyone remembered. Most of these candies faded because tastes changed, ingredients evolved, and new traditions took their place. But the stories behind them still linger. They remind us how simple the holidays used to be, and how much comfort can come from something small, sweet, and homemade. As you think about your own traditions, you might find yourself wanting to bring one of these old recipes back. Maybe not because they're the prettiest or the trendiest, but because they reconnect you with the quieter parts of the season, the slower afternoons, the shared moments, the memories tucked away in family kitchens. Thank you for taking this trip back with me, and whatever you're making this year, I hope it brings someone the same joy these forgotten candies once brought to so many homes.